Dr. Joe Handelsman is the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery at UW-Madison, and she is also a Vilas Research Professor and Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor. She is responsible for groundbreaking studies in microbiology and gender in science. Today, she will tell us about her return to Madison after serving President Obama's administration for 3 years as the Associate Director for Science in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in Washington, D.C. We look forward to your presentation, Dr. Handelsman, and we've made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way to say thank you for speaking with us today. As she comes to the podium, please remember, if time permits questions, please wait for one of the audience microphones.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you all for being here today and for all the great work that Rotary does. I'm a big admirer. So I was asked today to talk about 2 phases of my life, which started with my 3 years with President Obama in the White House as a science advisor, and then ended with my position here at the University of Wisconsin. So I'll tell you briefly about both of them, then we can pursue other aspects as well as stories about the president if you want after I finish. Are we advancing? Yes, okay. So I was at Yale University in between a long time at the University of Wisconsin and my return about a year ago. And after a few years at Yale, I got this call from the White House saying, why don't you come to Washington to be President Obama's second-in-command science advisor, heading up the science division of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And my immediate reaction was actually, no, that's another story for another day. But eventually I was talked into it, and that was one of the best decisions of my life. It was one of the most rewarding jobs I've ever had. And I had absolutely no idea what the Office of Science and Technology Policy did before I went there. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about the office, what we did, and the kinds of initiatives that we started under President Obama. So I'll start with the structure of the office and our relationship with the president, my division, which was the science division, and then how we made change. And that was the most interesting part of what I learned, besides learning about the president himself, was how government works and how change is made. We didn't make legislation, which for most of us is the major way that we hear about government policy being enacted, particularly in science. There's a lot else besides making legislation go through Congress, especially these days. And then I'll talk about one initiative briefly, the Precision Medicine Initiative, which was my first initiative with the president. And then I'll go on to talk about coming back to Madison. So the role of the Office of Science and Technology Policy is, like many other offices within the White House, to advise the president with expert advice on a particular area. And all of our areas were in science and technology, engineering, the general areas that you might imagine, although some reached into entirely unknown areas, new areas, that I actually didn't anticipate we'd be involved in, like the development of new technology, way ahead of where the industry was. One of the surprising things working in the government was actually how far advanced the government thinking is on many issues beyond where we see even scientists or technologists thinking. And so it was a really exciting and very cutting edge place to work. We would respond to what the president wanted to know. If he asked for a memo, for example, once on genomics, Saturday morning, I think he read an article in a back issue of a magazine about genomics in the world, and he called up John Holdren, his top advisor, and said, I need a memo. By Monday morning, we were supposed to have a memo on genomics for him. So sometimes it was in response to what he wanted. Other times it was initiatives that we were interested in, or that we thought were timely, or that the scientific community brought to us and then we brought to the president. We also managed crises. So the response part was partly what the president was interested in, but partly what was happening in the world. And my 2 big crises that involved a lot of management were the Ebola crisis, which I learned about 45 minutes after being sworn into office, and the Zika crisis, which was a little bit easier because it was a couple years later, and I actually knew something about how to work within government, but was a really tough problem nonetheless. We also worked on the budget process. So every year, the Office of Management and Budget develops the president's budget for him with his guidelines, and all of the other offices and the federal agencies bring their requests to OMB, and then there's a back and forth between the offices to get to the final budget and the president's sign off on it. And so every year we would start the budget process with OMB. As soon as the last budget was off the president's desk, we'd immediately start on next year's budget because it was such a long process to advocate for the science issues, the science education issues, and the many technology issues that we were responsible for bringing to the budget discussions. We were also responsible for looking for the gaps and opportunities across technology and science across the world. And so that part was very forward-thinking. And the president wanted us to be far ahead of where anybody else in the community was so that government policy could lead instead of follow. And there's a reputation that government is always kind of behind and learning from the scientific community. That was not my experience in many areas. In many areas, we were actually tugging on the scientific community and the industry to move forward into new areas that we thought were particularly timely or where there was tremendous opportunity for economic growth and technical growth and health, agriculture, environmental health. We also were responsible for keeping science and technology visible. And under President Obama, that was a particularly high priority because he loves science so much. He calls himself a science geek, and he really is. The science that we brought to him would tend to be the highlights of his day. He typically loved to learn about science, loved to solve scientific problems, and loved talking to his science advisors. So it was really a tremendous privilege to work for a president who loved what we do and what we brought to him so deeply and was so committed to making good policy in science. And so one of the things he really wanted was for the government to be out there thinking about where we could lead. And if you look back over the Obama policies that were developed, not just legislation, but policies that led new areas in science education and science and technology development, there really is a legacy of moving into areas that the scientific community had not even embraced. Some of those areas continue, and we can talk about specifics later if people are interested. Some have been repealed or reduced dramatically by the current administration. And then we had many responsibilities on a day-to-day basis for running various committees. We ran the process for selecting the presidential medals of science and technology and various other awards that the president would give. We ran task forces on particular issues like Ebola and Zika. And generally, the role of OSTP is to be the network that holds all of the federal agencies together. So on a topic like Ebola, when I called my first agency meeting, there were 26 different agencies there, from all of the defense units and the military to the National Institutes of Health, the CDC. I mean, you can imagine all the different ones that were involved, and then many that I certainly never expected to be interested in, like Department of Transportation turned out to be key to managing the Ebola crisis. And so the management task is enormous because obviously those 26 agencies have to be working in concert and not contradicting each other's work or undoing it. So those were some of the responsibilities we had, just to give you a flavor. The structure of OSTP was, it was run by John Holdren, who is a brilliant climate scientist and plasma physicist from most recently Harvard. He ran the science and technology operation for a full 8 years. In fact, 8 years and a month. He started before Obama was even inaugurated to develop the OSTP. He is older than I am, and I still can't quite imagine anybody having the energy to do it for 8 years. It's one of the most exhilarating but exhausting jobs in the world. And Holdren, I think, was just an absolute gift to this country in leading science advising for President Obama. His brilliance, his memory, his ability to learn various fields. I'd always feel that even though I was the biologist, once I had taught him something, he knew it better than I did. And that was true of the president as well. The two intellects that I worked with was really one of the great privileges of working in government, because President Obama and John Holdren deserved each other. They are both unbelievable minds. Under John were 4 divisions, and I ran, as I said, the science division, and I list myself as the Honorable Joe Handelsman because Holdren made me promise that I would use that title as many times as I could. It turns out that when you've been Senate confirmed and work in the White House, you have the Honorable before your name, and that lasts for life. So Holdren said, you know, you don't get many things to keep from this job, so use it for all it's worth. So the science division was responsible for all of basic science. And so the fundamental research efforts that the government funds and supports and manages and regulates in many ways, those were all under my division, as opposed to technology or some of the other areas that are less basic science that fell in other divisions. We did most of the work in biomedical sciences and public health. That's why the epidemics that I mentioned fell under our purview. We did food and agriculture, which has traditionally not been a strength of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, but it was something that I brought from my scientific background and thought was really important in this day and age, as did President Obama. So that became a major focus of our initiatives. We were also the home for STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math education, and developing the future workforce. And so we worked on many different initiatives to try to get more kids into science and technology, to keep college students engaged in science and technology studies, and then also to increase the modern qualities of our workforce in science and technology, including trying to diversify it scientifically, gender-wise, ethnically, and that was a major effort within the federal agencies in particular, because we argued that we can't really expect the rest of the scientific enterprise to diversify if the federal government hasn't done a good job and set a great example. So we worked really hard on that. And then one of the parts of the job that I was completely unprepared for, but turned out to be one of the most interesting and challenging, was the scientific infrastructure. So one of the first issues I took on was the management of a telescope, which is on the right, lower right in the slide, which is a radio telescope. It's an absolutely unique telescope that the United States built many years ago under the guidance of William Byrd, the senator. It's housed in West Virginia in this very unique valley where there are no waves allowed, no microwaves, no telephones, nothing. And that's important because it's a radio telescope. It would pick up all those waves. So it's this incredibly silent, beautiful place in the middle of nowhere. And there's this magnificent telescope that is about 485 feet high. And at the top point, you can see there, and I went all the way to the top, even though I'm afraid of heights. So I've always been very proud of that. That was a telescope that was under threat because the government didn't have the funding needed to keep it going. And one of the first things I wanted to work on was ensuring that telescope remained functional and remained supported, and it is still functional today, since it is unique. It can actually look at about 180 degrees of the skies because it's steerable. And most telescopes of its type, you can't move the dish the way you can this one. Just to give you a sense of perspective, the dish part of it is the size of several football fields. So when you're looking down on it, it is absolutely daunting. It's so large. From a distance, it looks much more modest. Another thing that we worked on were international treaties. And so the Super Collider, the CERN project in Switzerland, was up for renewal, and we re-upped the international treaty that the United States plays a big role in. And we had the partners from the international players and then all the agencies that play a role in the super colliders management. And so there were just enormous numbers of these kinds of things that I had no idea that the White House gets intimately involved in and manages throughout the process. We didn't have, what I discovered, very many levers. We didn't have very many ways of making change. But the ones we had tended to be pretty powerful. And most of them were based on influence more than anything else, just the sense that we were the White House and we were representing the president's voice when we spoke. And so we used executive orders, something that's been very controversial, contrary to popular belief. President Obama actually used this mechanism of governance less than his two previous predecessors. We used the making of national monuments to preserve various areas and ecological environments that were under threat. Those are ones that don't have to go through Congress for approval, unlike, for example, national parks, which are under congressional approval. So those are ones that we could work on not easily, I would say. They typically took about 18 to 24 months to bring to fruition, but several of them were pretty important for preservation of endangered species and endangered habitats. The president uses proclamations to make statements. These have no binding ability. They have no legal influence, but they do have an enormous influence on what people think. These are ways that the president can make statements of values, of importance, and inform the public, and we use those quite liberally. Presidential messages are even less binding than proclamations, but very important for the people who know about them. And that's the challenge in any of these, is getting the word out to the public, because you have the president's name behind them, but then if people don't know about the proclamation or the message, it has, of course, little impact. And so those were up to us to make sure were impactful. One of the most fun parts and challenging and competitive parts of the job was presidential speeches. It was always considered a real coup if you got a phrase or a few words into the State of the Union address. And so I remember one year somebody got the word antibiotic into the State of the Union, and everybody in my office was just cheering. Well, I had it really easy my first year because the president was very interested in precision medicine, and we were launching this initiative that he announced in the first State of the Union address that he gave while I was there. And we put a piece in one of the drafts, and the speechwriter chopped it way down, so it was down to about a phrase. The next time we saw the version of the speech, we saw the language expanded back up to a full paragraph on precision medicine. If you go back to the 2015 State of the Union, you'll see that. I think it's 3 sentences. And there's only one person that can reinstate things when the head speechwriter has cut them. So we knew that this was important to the president, because President Obama put back and even added some of his own language to ours. And precision medicine was a high priority for him throughout my time in the White House. My other contributions to the speechwriters didn't go quite as well as that, but that one spoiled me for all times. But of course, there were many other speeches that we would either write for him or draft pieces of, and his speechwriters were absolutely fantastic to work with. None of them were scientists, and they all were absolutely fluent in writing about science and making it understandable to the public. We also used event commitments, which I had no idea what this was, and it turned out to be one of the highest impact things that OSTP does. So OSTP and many other offices in the White House will have events where it's by usually invitation only, usually can be between 50 and hundreds of people will come to the event. And before the event, there is an effort that has to be very carefully managed. The language is very prescribed because you can very easily overstep what's allowed under law for the government to ask for. But we would obtain commitments from companies, from universities, from mayors. And these commitments were then announced at this White House event, whatever it might be. And so there was an enormous incentive for the people involved to have their commitment announced, because it was, of course, a very visible venue. But it also gave us an enormous collective commitment to state. So, for example, one of my colleagues got 75 mayors to agree to a particular policy in our largest cities nationwide. Others were, in one of our initiatives, we got about $1 billion commitment from the tech industry to develop training for kids in computer technology. So those were the kinds of things that we got to announce. And it was incredibly hard work to get these commitments, but enormously satisfying, because we had then this collective national effort on something that the president cared about. We also used our federal agencies, and those were, of course, in many ways, the way we embedded policy permanently. Many of the things that we did that are still standing and have not been undone in the last year are housed in the federal agencies. So National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and many others were our partners in many of these efforts, developing new programs that are still funded under their mandates. We also formed commissions. One that I'll just mention briefly was we started the Commission on Forensic Science, which was advisory to the Department of Justice and was intended to bring the science that is absolutely lacking in most forensic science, from fingerprints to matching bullets to hair analysis. All of those are grossly overused and overinterpreted in our courts, and we wanted to bring a scientific basis to all of those methods. And so the commission was started. Unfortunately, Jeff Sessions decided the commission wasn't needed, and last April terminated it. But I think it had a lasting impact, and there are efforts at the University of Wisconsin and several other campuses across the country to begin to work on forensics from a state level instead of the federal level. And then, of course, our biggest influence was just being the White House and saying that you represented the president, either a specific view or just being his representative, gave us a standing that enabled us to get opinions out to the press, to the public, to universities, to industry in very meaningful ways. And so it was an incredibly influential position in addition to having very specific levers for making change. So I mentioned my precision medicine initiative. This was the very first thing I did when I got to the White House, besides hearing about Ebola. And it was the most successful because the president was absolutely primed and knew about this long before I brought it to him. So the idea of precision medicine is that we need to be looking at medicine in a much more precise way, tailoring medicine to individuals much more precisely than we do now. So an example of precision medicine going way back are eyeglasses. Right? We don't have a generic prescription that everybody gets when they get eyeglasses. They're tailored to our particular eyesight and eyes. But when we have a condition like depression, we very often get a generic drug that, and I don't mean that in the generic sense, but just a standard drug that would be prescribed to many millions of people with the same condition, and it's not tailored. And it's no surprise then that many of our treatments have very low efficacy. I was surprised to find out that antidepressants, for example, individually have about 20% efficacy. So people have to try many drugs before they find one that works. Anti-cancer agents have similar deficiencies, many working only about 50% of the time. Some of the most common drugs that we use have relatively low efficacy. And so the idea is for both drug use and then many other prescriptions, not for drugs, but of other kinds of treatments, to make them more tailored to individual people. And so this was a major, I think I have a picture of it. A major effort of the president's. And we, in my office, developed the initial initiative in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health, VA, several other agencies. We developed the policy on data management and security and privacy issues, which are very important in precision medicine because we're going to be using very intimate information about people in precision medicine, from their genomes to their entire health records, to make medical decisions. We developed a series of research partnerships to ensure that the precision medicine research going forward included underserved people who are not typically the most populous members of scientific studies in medicine for a variety of historical reasons. And we gained in the initial round about $200 million of funding from Congress to fund the initial precision medicine efforts, which were focused largely on cancer, where the genetic profile of a tumor can dictate the kind of treatment that's used. And so matching the genetics of a tumor with the chemical drugs or treatments that are used can lead to much higher efficacy than just randomly using a treatment based simply on the organ that is under siege. So that was the beginning, but then we moved into other areas, and in the end, very close to the end of the administration, we got the 21st Century Cures legislation passed, which had a $4.8 billion commitment to precision medicine. And that was one of the most remarkable moments in my time at the White House because it passed both houses, and in the Senate, it was with 92 votes in favor. And there were very few things in my time in the White House that had that kind of bipartisan support. But that was an indication of how supportive our House can be, both the House and the Senate can be, of legislation regarding health. That was one of the easiest scientific issues to bring forward. And so on the lower right, you can see the group that went and presented the precision medicine initiative to the president. That's a picture in the meeting. Every time you go to visit the president for a formal briefing, you have to provide a memo ahead of time. And so we worked very hard on this memo for months to make sure that the president had all the information he wanted. And this is just an example of how wonderful it was to work for both John Holdren and the president. So we were sitting in this briefing and we were talking about the memo, and he kept asking John Holdren questions. And John was very aware of the fact that he's not a biologist and he's not a health expert, even though he could answer every question just fine. And he was very big on pushing his people forward in front of the president. So he said, well, Mr. President, I can keep answering your questions, but Joe really wrote the memo, so you should ask them of her. The president shifted in his chair and directed all of his questions at me, and he kept referring to the memo as Joe's memo. Well, of course, this was collective with a couple of agencies who were also represented there who were not very pleased about this being Joe's memo. But in the end, the president was fully supportive, and that was, of course, the most important thing. When he first mentioned the memo, he said, "Okay, let's get started here. Let me see if I got this right," in his usual very modest way. And then he laid out what he saw as the key points in the memo. Of course, he said it better than we could have said it and condensed it down to about a minute because he was very, very impressive, had the impressive ability to articulate ideas very sharply and quickly. He said, "So did I get it right?" And so when we walked out, and he did, of course, I said to John Holdren, I think we did a good job, right? He got it. The whole memo must have really made sense. And John said, "Yeah, great memo, good job." And the president said that too. He came running up to me afterwards, shook my hand, said, "Nice memo, Joe, nice memo. Thank you for that." And of course, he knew it was my first initiative. And so he was very, very careful to give me recognition and reinforcement because that's the kind of boss he was and probably still is. But I learned about a week later, I was reading old legislation that had been proposed about precision medicine. And in 2006, this legislation had not gone anywhere, but it had been introduced to the Senate by Senator Obama. So "let me see if I got this right" line, very, very cute, Mr. President. So I'd like to go on to, just after giving you a taste of a very intense and complicated few years of my life. Toward the end, I was approached by the administration at the University of Wisconsin-Madison about being the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And interestingly, 10 years ago, I was on a planning committee for the Institute. I was on the faculty here, and before I left for Yale, I was very excited about this idea of this new institute to really emphasize interdisciplinary research that would bring people together in new ways around problems that affect people in very, very important and significant ways. But then I left and I kind of lost track of what was done. And when I visited Madison to see my father periodically, I saw the building being built, and then I saw it from the outside. But I actually had not been in the building until I interviewed for this position. And I had every plan to go back to Yale from the White House. But this seemed like an opportunity that was absolutely unique and very, very enormous in terms of the opportunity to do many of the things that I had been working on in the White House for implementing interdisciplinary research and trying and experiment new ways of doing interdisciplinary research and new ways of doing student training as well. And so it has, in my first year, certainly lived up to all of those expectations. It's been an amazing year. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview of where WID is going. You've probably passed our beautiful building on University Avenue, but many people don't know beyond what we do on the ground floor, which is largely the outreach part of it. Many people don't know what it is that WID does. So our goal is to experiment with new kinds of research, and that's more ways of doing the research than the topics, so that we end up having a synthesis of ideas and strategies for understanding the world around us and developing technology to address issues of the world that might not have come up with the traditional ways that we do research. And so we want to build connections within WID with our neighboring institute, the Morgridge Institute, whose director is here, Brad Schwartz, one of our guests today. We share the building and we're right next to each other, so it's relatively easy for us to collaborate, but we bring very different perspectives. So it's a very, very potent collaboration. And then we want to reach out to the University of Wisconsin campus and generate new kinds of collaborations, new ways of generating ideas in research. And finally, we want to build on the many, many connections with the state of Wisconsin that have already been developed from WID, from Morgridge, and of course from the long history of the university, but develop those in new ways. And so I thought I would just tell you very briefly about a couple of things that we're doing. So we developed a series of hubs. We have currently 3 hubs, and these are intended to be focal points for particular areas of research for the campus and ultimately for the state. We want to provide services. So one, for example, is an area of bioinformatics, a kind of analysis of biological data that many people on the campus need to be able to do, but don't have the tools to work with the data. And so we want to provide that service. So we've recently hired an expert in bioinformatics, and that service will be available to people using the kind of data that service will provide throughout the campus. And we think that this will really transform many of the areas of research that could use the technology, but in fact don't, because the experts are experts in something else, not in the analysis of the data that we can offer. We're also serving as a physical place to bring together groups from across campus who are interested in common issues. And one of the strategies that we've developed actually came right from my experience in the White House. One of the things that we were required to do by law was when we started a new initiative, we had to announce it in the Federal Register. And I was very naive about this process because I never read the Federal Register, and most people I knew didn't read the Federal Register. So I thought, who in the world is going to contribute comments about our initiative? What are they going to know about precision medicine or the microbiome or soil science? And I thought it was just one of those pro forma things that you have to do because the government says you have to do it. And so I would twiddle my thumbs and wait until we could move on after the 30 days or 60 days of posting in the Federal Register was done, and we would move on. But what I discovered was that it wasn't just moving on. It was finding out the most incredible ideas that the public would have. And the public spanned from the greatest experts in the field to people who made passing observations that were incredibly insightful. And what I discovered was the very obvious thing once I realized it, that there are a lot of people out there that we never had the time to ask, never thought to ask, didn't know about, so why would we ask them, who had tremendous ideas to offer. And it was a form of crowdsourcing of ideas. And that was one of the most creative processes I discovered in the White House. So when I came back to academia, I said, there has to be a way to do that in academic science, of getting ideas and input from sources that you'd never really think about yourself, but will come to you. And so instead of the typical collaboration that most scientists engage in, where they pick the 3 people that they know of who do the right kinds of things in the area, and they say, will you work with me? And then they develop a collaboration. We're just trying something different, and we're trying a crowdsourcing approach. And so when we develop a problem or a question that is particularly difficult and challenging, we're putting out the word to the entire campus and saying, come and tell us what you would do to solve this problem. And the first time we did this, we had 100 people come to talk about how to use data science more effectively and how to serve the campus better in data science. So we think that there's a real need there, that if you open the door, there are a lot of people with ideas on an area that you never really imagined. So one of the areas I work in is the microbiome. I never would have guessed that somebody that runs social science surveys in Wisconsin is fascinated by the microbiome, which is the collection of microorganisms associated with the human body. And it turns out that there's a sociologist that I didn't even know existed who has been a tremendous collaborator on microbiome research. That's just one of dozens of examples of people who have come forward. So that's one of the kinds of experiments that WID is doing, asking if we open the door and we just issue a very broad invitation, can we get the benefit of creativity from a much broader group of people? So the hubs right now are in data sciences, which is one of the strengths of WID, multi-omics, which is using genomics, the microbiome, all the other profiling that we can now do in biological systems to characterize systems and then generate really big data sets that can describe those systems and compare systems to each other. And the third hub is called the Illuminating Discovery Hub. And I'll just tell you very briefly about one project there because you may have heard about it on the news, and I think it's something that we hope you'll be hearing more about in the future. So Illuminating Discovery is all about communication of science between scientists, among scientists of different fields, and then between scientists and the public. And so we have several initiatives that are intended to expand the pool of people in society who can focus on science and make contributions to it. And I'll just mention the last one, which is the Small World Initiative. This is an initiative which is actually, I started it at Yale and brought it here when I came. It's actually now across the world. And the idea is to use the power of crowdsourcing with undergraduate students to discover new antibiotics. And so there are several goals to this project, but the key research goal is discovering new antibiotics to address what's really a terrible crisis right now. There's an enormous rise of antibiotic-resistant infections. We're running out of antibiotics to treat many of those, and the investment from the pharmaceutical industry has been cut way back from the 1980s till now, and that is leaving us with a very empty pipeline of new drugs. So we had the idea that we could tap the source where most of our antibiotics come from, which is soil bacteria, and have students in undergraduate classes isolate bacteria that produce antibiotics and use that creative force of undergraduates for discovery. And so the undergraduates take soil samples, they culture bacteria from the soil samples through a pretty simple process, but is eye-opening and very exciting to anyone who hasn't done it before. And then they test them for the ability to kill human pathogens or relatives of human pathogens. In our hands now, we have about 10,000 students across the world taking this course. Pretty much every student gets some antibiotic-producing bacteria from their efforts. Our challenge now is to figure out which of those are producing novel antibiotics or which ones are producing the old ones that we know well. But we're finding that even short of doing that, there are many other benefits in terms of inspiring students in global health, studying a global health problem and feeling like a contributor to solving that problem. They're engaging in real, authentic research, and even if they don't go on in science, we think that's critical for them understanding what science is about and how to interpret scientific data. And they're linking with a worldwide network of students, of thousands and thousands of students all over the world who are taking this course and looking for new antibiotics. We also have a training workshop of about 5 days, twice a year. We just had the first Wisconsin version in January. We did that because we know that people all over the country wanted to come to Madison in January. It was extremely successful. And we had 30 instructors from universities and colleges all over. But in this particular one, we concentrated on Wisconsin campuses. And so you can see from the map that we have this is actually only a partial map. We now have about 15 more campuses in the US, but we have them all over the country. But Wisconsin was actually not represented until recently. Now we have currently 12, and I think there will be as many as 20 campuses in Wisconsin, technical colleges, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, liberal arts colleges, who will be teaching the Small World Antibiotic Discovery class. So we are well represented across the United States. We're expanding worldwide. And we have a particular partnership in Wisconsin where not only are we engaging all of these faculty across the UW system and beyond, but they are then in turn engaging with citizens to collect soil samples and learn about the antibiotics in the soil that they collect. So we've started to engage the public very heavily in this process, and we're hoping that eventually everyone in Wisconsin will feel like a contributor to solving the antibiotic crisis. So I will stop there with a few images of both WID, and I invite you to come visit the Discovery Building, as well as some images of my time with the president. And thank you for your attention. I'll stop there.
So in the interest of time, anyone who has questions for Dr. Handelsman, please come to the front of the room. And before we adjourn, I want to congratulate Karen Kendrick Hands and Larry Hands on the birth of their granddaughter, Eleanor Hands, at 11:22 today. We are adjourned.